So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Depends where you are in the world. And welcome to today's 9-grid session for talent acquisition. We'll be looking at the new 9-grid from led by David and Sven. I'll introduce them in a moment. Next slide, please. So many of you actually know Fosway already. We've been in the business for over 25 years, really conducting research. Research is fundamental to what we do, be it around next-gen HR, talent or learning, also analyst and advisory services to well over 3,000 corporate customers across Europe primarily, but also with a global focus. Many of the global organizations with European functions we work with as well. And we're also very well known for our vendor research and EMEA market commentary. And most of that research actually is available via our website and also via our corporate membership. So after session, jump on the website, have a good look around. Today's speakers are David Wilson, who is CEO of Fosway Group, and also Sven Elbert, who is a senior analyst with a focus on talent acquisition. So a few basic housekeeping points before we kick off today's session. Just making sure that everyone gets the most out of the next 50 minutes or so. Use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, provide input. We'll actually be addressing all the questions at the end of the session, so please put your questions in there, and one of my colleagues will be compiling those questions, and we'll do our best to answer all those questions as we come to the end of the session. We'll kick off with some introductory content, and a recording has been made of this session, and that will be available on our website along with the presentation about a week or so from now. Over to you, David.
Hi, and afternoon, everybody from me too. Hopefully you can hear me. Yes. From a rather sunny UK for a change. Don't normally say that when we run these sessions. Before we go into the actual 9-grid, so the focus obviously of the session today is to talk about the 9-grid for talent acquisition and to give you an opportunity to ask questions and discuss, for us to discuss some of the kind of themes around that. We always try and cover off a little bit of kind of context around this, just so that people understand where the 9-grids come from. And I think the key thing is that each 9-grid for us is based on a pretty much a monster research process. There's lots of elements to it. It takes a long time to build it. I think talent acquisition, we're now in our fourth iteration or fifth iteration. I can't remember what it is. But we were working on it for actually 3 or 4 years prior to the first iteration as well. So it's a lot of research that goes into it, and then cumulatively a lot more each year. We aim to get as much input as we can, particularly from the buyer side, from the corporates themselves, the companies, who are the, who's doing what with whom, what works, what doesn't, what do they really think of it. So things like a corporate research network and the members and the roundtables we run around that, the inquiry process that we run, any private inputs that we provide to corporates around their talent acquisition choices or ecosystem, or their wider HR ecosystem, and how that impacts talent acquisition as well. On top of that, we then run obviously a public research process. We run public surveys. We'll talk a bit later on. I think we'll probably ask you to put some input to our TA realities research, for example. And every time we run those, we also ask for input on the vendors that companies are using and their satisfaction with those. And then on top of that, so this runs pretty much an all year round process. We then, associated with each 9-grid, run a structured data capture process and a vendor briefing process alongside that. So that is capturing information around the functional capabilities of those vendors, customer referencing, information around pricing and cost, and then of course around customers and partners and things like that. We then independently brief with those vendors. We then engage with them through user conferences and customer events. And then ultimately we have a formal customer referencing process. So all of the customer information provided to us, we survey all of those, and we also arrange conversations with selected parts of that to also make sure we cover off that. So there's each one of these processes said is a bit of a monster. The key question we often get asked is who gets included and why? And in some ways the answer to that is very simple. So when we go back to that corporate research network. So our main audience is typically mid or large enterprise organizations, typically EMEA headquartered or the EMEA end of global. So ultimately, when we're looking at the 9-grid, we track a much larger number of vendors, obviously, than we can include in any particular 9-grid, although the number of included obviously continues to increase to some degree. The main thing we're looking for is, who is actively being used within that corporate network. Another two of the customers, where do we have real customer insight and experience? Who are they actively considering? So either if they're in a formal procurement process or they're just researching options and so on. And talent acquisition particularly is an ecosystem market. So we get perspectives from all parts of the ecosystem from other parts of it as well. So we get kind of a view from that side. And then finally, who are the innovator companies that Fosway sees as having the potential to be disruptive or to achieve presence in there. You don't buy your way onto a 9-grid. There's no way of paying to be on it. You can't pay to be off it either. You can't decline to be included. The decision is purely Fosway's based on who we see as relevance to, as I said, that corporate audience that we're really trying to serve. I talked about the research process behind it and how extensive it is. And I think the key thing that I really want to emphasize is, whilst we run a very extensive vendor input process, including briefings and functional capture and comparisons and so on, we have thousands and thousands of data points behind each 9-grid each time. The reality is the view that we'll always take as dominant around this is the customer experience. So although we obviously do ask the vendors how they play and what they do, what we're most interested in ultimately is what their customers think of them. And that ultimately will be the thing that really has the dominant view when it comes down to the decision process on the analysis, whether that's around absolute positioning within the 9-grid or on the trajectory. So in summary, we have lots and lots of customer insight. We have lots of hard data and input around the vendors. And we also obviously have a lot of cross assumptions that we get from different things. So we have a lot of stuff that we put together on each one. Ultimately, that then gets distilled into the diagram, the pretty picture, if you like, the matrix, the actual 9-grid itself. But of course, the other thing that goes alongside that, which we would always recommend that you do, is actually to download and read the reports. And Sven, in a second, is just going to start to talk about some of selected trends around this. But one of the things that's really important there is to understand, if you understand the trends and how we're looking at it, you also understand how we're assessing vendor capability and innovation. There are clearly fast-moving changes going on within the market. And we're obviously, particularly when we're looking at trajectory and future roadmap and stuff like that, we're looking at how well those vendors will meet those needs as well. So read the report, look at the trends, understand when we're talking about somebody as a specialist, in other words, a square within the 9-grid, what their specialisms actually are and so on, because that will give you an awful lot more insight. So on that, I'm going to hand over to Sven and actually talk about the actual 9-grid this year.
Thank you, David. Just to make sure everybody can hear me okay, I guess I'll mention that my headphones are causing my head to turn red because it's quite hot here in Germany as well. And red is actually an interesting one because last year the talent acquisition market was red hot. And obviously some significant shifts have happened to the world economy across the last 12, 18 months. And obviously that has had an impact on the talent acquisition market. Before I talk about the grid, and you know that the Fosway 9-grids have value, the vendors that are placed on it have value to customers in every zone, so not just the top right. But before I cover that in a bit more detail, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the key headlines that are also obviously covered in the report. And when probably we started putting out the first full version of the 9-grid in 2020, so there was obviously a point in time where some of the classic ATS vendors that had been dominating the space for years and years at that time were becoming increasingly under pressure by suites that had the full focus on the full talent acquisition funnel, from candidate relationship management, from attracting candidates across the hire and selection kind of steps in the process into onboarding. And also HCM suites had obviously invested and continue to invest significantly in it. And only 3 years later, I think we are now at a point where the market is getting disrupted yet again. And particularly some specialist providers, some of the wider suite players as well are looking into disrupting by using experience, intelligence, and automation features. So I think particularly there's a bit of a battle going on between the HCM suites, the talent acquisition suites, and some of those specialists, and that is really disrupting even some of the more classical talent acquisition suites. So another thing probably around which is important to understand where we are placing vendors this year is that obviously the US job market was already hit relatively heavily in the last part of 2022. If you remember, there were many tech companies who were announcing significant layoffs, while in Europe, there were still countries, significant countries where the job market was still, you know, quite red hot, as I said, like my head. So I think that is, I guess, where Europe has been a bit more resilient, and the vendors who had a strong footprint in Europe and strong customer base in Europe found it easier to cope. Also, the buyers obviously still needed to hire more. Still have we still see a bit of a skills availability crisis even nowadays, although the recession is now also hitting Central European and the UK as well. So, but I think that is an important one to remember. And during the research cycle for input this year, also there was obviously this big marketing hype on social media, on the news around generative AI, around ChatGPT, and others like Google Bard and so on. And so that is shaping vendor solutions as we speak. The interest from the buyer side is high into that. There's obviously in Europe, in some countries, Germany, France, in particular, probably some more skepticism or concern around data privacy, and the EU is working on the AI Act. So definitely something where a lot of vendors are putting their investment dollars into that. But it's not only generative AI, it's certainly also in how solutions understand skills, how they provide intelligence to users about where, you know, maybe to where they can find the talent, which talent pools to dip into in terms of the job board market or the social media kind of channels. So those are definitely solutions to be aware of as well. And particularly, I guess, we see also since the pandemic that interviewing is continued to be innovated through by many vendors. Almost everyone is continuing to invest. So corporates really should take every step of the innovation if they can, because there's some really efficient drivers for efficiency in that. So that's maybe some things around the headlines. I guess, David, if you want to add, or maybe I could talk a little bit about the vendors and the space. I guess you're on mute, maybe.
Talk about the vendors.
Yeah, let's do that first then. So, yeah, obviously, we have a few more inclusions. As you know, we differentiate between suites, which are the circles, and the specialists, which are the squares. We cover maybe a bit more of only one or two, or even multiple specialisms. And so we have seen, for example, that I think Phenom, Eightfold, Radency, those kind of specialists, Clever Connect is another example, Smart Dreamers to some degree, they are starting to expand their solution portfolio. They usually sit on top of an HCM system or a talent management suite where they enhance usually candidate experience, interviewing experience, those kind of things. and they produce good outcomes in combination. In reality, however, if we look at them on a functional level, they are really in reality not much far away from being a full talent acquisition suite themselves. So they already retain a lot of the data that is also sitting in an HCM suite or in a talent acquisition suite as the main system of record. However, they don't obviously want to be seen as such, because that could potentially hurt their relationship to some of those suite players in the market. And then I guess that is one particular category of vendors. The talent acquisition suite providers like in Smart Recruiters and Avature, a Greenhouse, those kind of folks we have been tracking for many, many years. We also have added a few more local players into the DACH and in the French Eastern Europe markets even now. So those have been interesting additions. And as I said, those with European heritage have performed quite well up until probably also the first and second quarter, even, the first quarter and well into the second. During 2023, we have some new inclusions as well from that perspective, like Iaku in the UK as a provider, or Higher Road, eRecruiter. Onlyfy is a rebrand from Prescreen, who are mainly focused on the market in Germany, Austria, Switzerland. They sit on together and on top are owned by the same other company than the Xing network, which continues to be a stronger social media kind of channel similar to LinkedIn here locally. So those are a couple of inclusions maybe to mention. I guess also one of the things I guess that AI is changing, and generative AI also in particular is changing, is how the market looks at how you select candidates and how you kind of assess them. So the CV, the application letter, those kind of things are getting supported by AI more and more. And corporates are looking at assessment providers to obviously get a more objective view to actually assess real skills. And so this year we have decided to also include more assessment specialists into the 9-grid. Folks like a Brig who have been in potential challenger, I think also last year already. Vervo have moved up to potential challenger. They're headquartered in Australia and obviously is placed strongly also internationally in the US a bit more. Arctic Shores is a UK headquartered provider of game-based assessments. Assess First, French headquartered, also quite an innovative one, and around, or a new kind of version of their assessment around. It's a bit like Tinder, so it's no longer these long questionnaires that you have to fill in, but you just swipe left or right with an answer. Obviously, there's no pictures being displayed, but just things where you have to agree or disagree. And that accelerates, I guess, how you can run these, and also opens it up to other target groups, more to operational workforce, which has been a very significant driver. And in the US, I guess there's also vendors who've specialized in that a little bit. But yeah, that's probably just a few things to mention. But I want to be obviously aware of questions and kind of things you have maybe for us. So David, if you want to add anything to that, or we can maybe jump into the questions, whatever.
I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to add very quickly, because I do want to get to questions. I mean, one is, it's kind of interesting looking at the competitive space around the HCM providers and their recruiting offer, and the way in which they have really continued to strengthen the position and the competitive position in the market, especially with quite a strong ecosystem play around them and key partners, and seeing companies like Phenom and Eightfold and Beamery potentially being quite important as part of some of that play. versus the TA suites as well, which are continuing to try and consolidate, versus the specialists, as you said, Sven, that are almost becoming semi-suites in their own right as well, but maybe very much focused around an AI story or skills. The other one, I think, possibly was the addition of Paradox in there within the strategic challenger. So that's a new ad for us in obviously quite an assertive position. Beamery moving into strategic challenger out of core leader, again, is probably quite a significant change. So I think there's a lot of changes going on here. One thing it's worth re-emphasizing is we zero-base the analysis of this every year. In other words, we start the whole process from scratch, right? So the functional model is adapted and reanalyzed from scratch with new capture. The analysis process that goes on within the analyst team, the peer review process, etc. This is rebuilt from scratch each time. So somebody can look like they're in the same place, but actually they've been reassessed there. Market average from a functionality this year will be different to market average last year. Somebody could have delivered a roadmap and think they have done a lot, but in reality, if everybody else has done more, they might go back relative to the whole market as a whole. And that sometimes reflects in terms of trajectory and so on as well. So those are all kind of key things, but maybe we should kind of hand back. Liam, do you want to come in and maybe start to ask some of the questions?
Sure. Yeah. So we've got some questions from the audience, and we've also, as I said, a couple through beforehand. Both Sven and David, could you expand on the interview revolution besides the move to virtual interviews?
Yeah, so obviously the pandemic has probably spiked corporate interest in virtual interviews. That is one part of the story. Of course, one angle I think is around obviously making sure that these interview scheduling processes are more efficient, that they are really deeply embedded into the Outlook or Google calendars of folks, that things are easy to reschedule if something needs to be moved around. So there has been a lot of investment in that area. The other angle is that some providers, some specialist providers are also now using AI to transcribe interviews, to help organizations and hiring managers in particular to become a better interviewer. So having some training on the platform and those kind of things.
Actually, on that, there is a question specifically around AI. So we were asked, how do you see generative AI impacting how organizations select candidates?
Yeah, this is work in progress, right? So I have an example from my immediate family. My niece has applied for a scholarship, and she has used ChatGPT to improve her application, which ultimately probably won her the scholarship. Sorry, Anna Maria, for mentioning you here, but I guess it's certainly something where the first early adopters in the business to consumer world probably have started to adopt this, have seen good success, and now everybody will be doing it. So I guess from that perspective, corporates need to, who have maybe been relying a lot on the CV or on the application letter or some other sort of input from the candidates which was written, and need to challenge a little bit their assumptions around how they use it, and assessments or testing, virtual conversations, the classic interview is becoming more and more important. And we are also seeing AI getting infused even into those video interviews where you can measure length of responses, quality of responses. There's a lot of things that technology can enable. But on the other hand, from the corporate perspective, there's also obviously concerns around automating too much, how reliable, how valid are these assessments, and the AI that is underpinning it. So from that perspective, the EU and several states in the US are preparing to pass legislation. And I think we need that to be in place as an industry as a whole, probably to up everybody's game to that level and have a bit of like a similar to maybe what we do with the GDPR. I'm not sure that obviously from a German perspective that, yeah, exactly. So it's a bit of a monster, I guess, what the GDPR did. But what it did was that it kind of put up a standard with an ISO 27001, which is a third-party auditing provider on this standard. And then basically you as a customer have the security and the trust in that vendor that they do everything possible to make sure that they're handling our data privacy well. And here it's also that they're making sure that the AI is, unbiased and is getting improved in that sense with every iteration as it learns. So I think that is some of the things probably to highlight around that.
I mean, just to add to that, I'm not sure we have any corporate conversations where the generative AI thing is not like almost the first question they're asking. And there can't be almost any vendor briefings or things now where, they're not trying to work out how they put this in their roadmap or immediately trying to deliver something. And I think one of the things, just to build on what Sven was saying, is we have been looking at AI in the talent acquisition market, like we have in talent and skills and some of these other areas for multiple years. I have my very early career background, I started doing AI 30 odd years ago. So I was always really interested in it. And I think we could do a 9 group with just AI startups in TA, for example, on its own before, OpenAI and ChatGPT was announced. Since that point, it's become an absolute wall of noise. And I describe it as almost like the elephant in the room, but the really, really, really noisy one that's jumping up and down all the time, so nobody else can really focus on anything other than this. And it's the problem is that what we're seeing is there's this almost tsunami of noise around it, and a lot of there was some really good thinking and understanding that was being developed around that. It's just been completely outflanked by the generative AI kind of piece. And vendors that had no capability now suddenly have an AI story, right? But no understanding. And vendors that had a really good AI story have almost, in some cases, been at risk of binning that because they need to get on board with the generative AI thing. And I think the challenge for all of us is to work out where the substance is within the story. We're already starting to see, obviously some concern and negativity around it as well. Invented law cases and things like this, and etc. I think the key thing, though, and also if we a bit of a parallel looking at it as we look at it within the learning arena, some of the techniques which we were starting to focus on to analyze electronically submitted content suddenly has no validity anymore, because we don't know that the content was ever authentic or anything else like this. So what Sven talked about, which is putting pressure back onto the more human elements within the process and trying to make them more discerning. So there's definitely massive opportunities here, right? But there are also, I think, massive challenges, both to the process and the validity of the process, as well as the risks that we just make the wrong hiring decisions. And ultimately, that's the critical thing.
We have a follow-on question around that, actually, David, that maybe either Sock and Sven could answer. Something you raised just then is any thoughts on how should orgs like yours and companies like ours help inform legislation, especially since AI is so fast moving? So it's a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah, and I think the danger is that in some ways it's the most noisy players that are the ones that are involved in trying to inform that legislation. And I think there is, to some degree, the horse has bolted here, right? So I think it's hard to turn this stuff off afterwards. Sven referenced GDPR, and obviously that was a very explicit exercise after effectively we were in the Wild West from a data protection point of view, to build in constraints and approvals around what actually was legitimate in terms of use of data. And to some degree we will do that, we'll try and do that within AI. as well. But I think the reality is that a lot of this stuff has already moved very quickly. So I think all we can do is, large employers, I think, have a critical role to play in stepping up and actually being part of some of that discussion. Similarly, some of the larger vendors clearly do. The reality is it will take quite a long time, and the risk is that what you'll see is a defensive shutdown, turning, a demand to turn it off before we understand what it can do as well. So I don't know. It's not a straightforward process. What we know is, I mean, I was listening to Bloomberg earlier today, and they said, because they were talking about generative AI on Bloomberg and how it's impacting everything. Said, and they were talking about the US government has been unable to control the internet, right? Let alone what it can control with AI. So this is really, I think there's some really significant issues here. What we have to do, though, is seek, I think, sensible mid pathways, right? That we can understand what is possible here. We have to recognize that this stuff is already out there, that nieces and nephews of Sven are applying for positions using some of this technology, that, and that therefore there is a potential on both sides of the fence for this to be an issue to be dealt with. But as I said, every corporate we talk to is asking about it. In some cases, some of them, one of the organizations we were talking to yesterday, they had already made $1 billion commitment to engaging with it on the corporate level, right? So $1 billion investment across the whole, across the whole of their organization. So yeah, the horse has bolted here, right, to some degree. I mean, what we need to do is to channel that in a constructive way.
Yeah, I think if I can add to it, so there's also, of course, everybody in the recruitment domain is thinking about how to apply it to your own domain, right? How can it help me, write better job descriptions and that kind of thing, and that is fine, right? This is important, but also understanding what impact it has on the skills of the people that work in your organization, what new skills you need, what other skills you need, and how you build them, where to find them. I think that is also what recruiters should probably ask these days. I think from that perspective, also in terms of the focus around it, think a little bit bigger and a bit out of the box, I guess, around it. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And another question, moving slightly away from generative AI, more back onto aspects of recruitment and learn, high volume recruitment, and differences between geographies. The question is, in the US, we see more and more vendors focusing on high volume recruiting. Do you see these gain traction within EMEA too?
Yeah, so high volume recruiting is, I guess, a term usually used within certain industries where it's around retail, or potentially a lot of turnover, where you find maybe a lot of more turnover in those kind of types of roles, in logistics, potentially somewhat in manufacturing, where it's a bit more seasonal sometimes, the demand. And so in the US, we've seen that there was a lot of automation going on to the ultimate extreme of it becoming a zero-touch hiring experience even. And there's some specialized vendors who have started to put out solutions and who have had great success in certain verticals or certain industries. Europe is a bit slower and a bit behind on picking up on some of those. So there's a bit of a difference, yes, I would say, but certainly also from how these solutions would fit into Europe. I think there's more of a cultural awareness around respect, being mindful of a respectful relationship to the individual, having a face-to-face or virtual face-to-face conversation at least once before you actually hire someone. I mean, just automating it fully means that you really have no interaction. You can get a job and turn up Monday morning to the 8 a.m. shift or whatever. And the cultural aspects in some regions within Europe, I guess, are different to that. So vendors, I don't think from the US cannot just one-to-one copy what they are very successful with, maybe in the States, into Europe. There has to be a bit of a local adjustment into the European you know, the labor markets are different, the culture is different, the works councils have a different role, unions play a different role, and all of that needs to be considered when you implement it here.
I think building on that though, there's also, it's like, how do you optimize what we're talking about, whether it's, you know, in this case, obviously around talent acquisition, recruiting, onboarding, etc., to the audience and the target that you're talking about. I think one of the things that happened within the pandemic period and post-pandemic period was the kind of realignment in some ways that I say companies discovered their critical talent was the person driving the bus, not necessarily the chief executive of the company, right? So suddenly what you've seen is a really heavy shift to the optimization of a lot of the processes that are geared towards that. Because what we shouldn't forget is despite all of the challenges we've been through, we are at historically low numbers in terms of the available talent market to be recruited, right? So 3.8% unemployment or something, when people used to think that full employment was closer to not 5% out of work. So we've got continued pressure around that, and then obviously particularly in that kind of knowledge worker sense, and obviously some of the tech spaces and so on, just a complete inability to find and hire enough people at all. So how do you really optimize? And that's reflected in the 9-grid as well, with the rise of, you know, the specialisms around talent experience and skills, and how do you really create a very contextually relevant process and outcome set that's targeted towards those as well. So in some ways, how do we optimize for those two audiences, both the high volume frontline worker on one level, where it's very, very simple and easy and very automated, maybe trying to work at very high scale. And on the other one is, how does this really work with the very high skill, completely unavailable people, and how do we really make that process work? So it's kind of interesting as to how that's developed within the market.
Thanks, David. I've got a question that's more around the trends within the 9-grid, and actually I think this is just applicable to the other 9-grids we do on learning systems and digital learning and core HCM, etc. So the question is it possible for you to show the results of the last 3 years side by side, or one after the other, so that you can see the changes better? And could you then use the changes to make an analysis of why these changes have occurred? So big question.
Yeah, so I mean, so not in the context of this webinar or this session, we can't, right? So actually, interestingly, I have done some of that in the background on some of the other topics. I mean, for example, learning systems one, I think we're now 11th iteration or something on it. And I think the challenge a little bit is because, as I said, we zero base it each year. So actually, it's not like we're basing it on exactly the same functional criteria, or even, for example, when we're looking at some of those specialism areas within it. So it's not just as simple as kind of putting them side by side and see how they go. But obviously you can see trends emerge there. So the emergence of specialists, for example, within the ecosystem. Sven already talked about the fact that go back 5-10 years ago, most of this market conversation was dominated by probably ATSs, you know, applicant tracking systems and job boards and things like that, whereas now it's a very different market we're in. Obviously, from a vendor space, the other interesting thing about the vendor space is, you know, I think one of the things when you're looking at most of the Fosway 9-grids, if not all of them, is that, you know, we're looking at EMEA weighted global. So we're typically looking at what is relevant for an EMEA headquartered multinational company, because most companies don't get very big before they become multinational, or a EMEA end of a global or something like that. Obviously, you know, we get quite a lot of readership actually from North America around the 9-grids and so on, but we are waiting for that towards that more international organization. And I think when you start to look at that, the other thing that Sven, you know, talked about earlier was you see the rise of national players that then become transnational, new players that become more aspirational. There's been a lot of capital, private equity money that's been sat there looking to be invested in some of these markets as well. So actually you've seen the rise of acquisitions and the changes, and that's reflected in this 9-grid versus last time. Sometimes that leads to a rebrand because some or something like that as well. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting process in the background, but actually strictly overlaying the 9 grids doesn't really tell you the story, because there's so many things that change each year in the assessment process. And as I said, you know, market average for 2023 is going to be different to market average in 2022. And somebody can have increased functionality and have a negative trajectory because everybody else has accelerated faster. So these things are definitely more complicated. The one thing you can tell is there is pressure for inclusion of more companies. You know, that's one of the things that we struggle with a little bit. But you know, as the market's got much bigger, it's accelerated, the rise of the specialisms within the ecosystem. Ultimately, even with that filter of like who is relevant to our target corporate demographic and who are they considering, that list keeps getting longer, not shorter.
Okay, thanks, David. Got a question around, I guess, permanent contingent workforce in an organization. Could you comment on the role of direct sourcing and talent pools for contingent workforce acquisition in the grid, also some of them spanning permanent and contingent hiring?
Yeah, I guess that is a big one, I guess, to ask. So there's obviously a specialized sub-market, I guess, for contingent workforce hiring to some degree. So we don't track all of the providers, but there are a few specialists on here, and also some suite players who have a proposition in the space and can help corporates with a solution. And so that obviously, as I guess the world is getting more flexible in terms of where you work, when you work, who works for you might be also more on a seasonal kind of basis. During a recession, some organizations obviously put more effort into that kind of contingent workforce, or put more eggs in that basket. I guess it really is good to look at those solutions, but it's not a primary area of immediate focus to include all the other players in that space, because there's a lot of other things involved, I guess, from a functional capability model that the talent acquisition functional model that we use does not fully cover. However, we obviously track them and are aware of them, but it's certainly not something that we would put them on this grid. Okay. David, do you want to add to that maybe, or?
No. I mean, the only thing I would say is that we are interested in the holistic view of people, right? So, in other words, when we look at organizations from a wider HR and talent perspective as well, I think it is really important to think about the whole value chain that surrounds them. And that can include, you know, not just contingent labor, but also things like partner, you know, resources within your partner network and your supply chain and all sorts of things like that. I think as we get more technology enabled and driven around a lot of this stuff, you know, we start joining up more of those dots on an overall level as well. So it's a complicated landscape.
Okay, got quite a niche question around this year's 9 grid. The report also speaks about how Eastern Europe is becoming a hot spot for talent acquisition. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that, Sven?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably 2 angles to that. Eastern Europe, with probably as a region, has already seen a lot of Central European companies invest in the region and dipping into those talent pools. There's a bit of an acceleration of that trend due to maybe some of the geopolitical changes we are seeing, China versus the US, Russia, Europe, and all of that. So there's probably more companies thinking about where can they, you know, open up some factories or whatever and de-risk their supply chains. So there's interest in the talent in that market. And I guess also from a talent acquisition market perspective, we are also seeing Eastern Europe now more where vendors are popping up and also bringing their solutions to the rest of EMEA and also more widely internationally. So quite an interesting spot and place to look for talent, and also to look at the vendors maybe that come from that space. Because in the background, usually some of the more European orientated vendors have also nearshored some of their development work maybe to some of those countries in the past. But now these local players from, say, Poland or Romania or the three Baltic states, they are also bringing out their own solutions, and so they're competing for the local talent. And it's a bit of an interesting fight there going, I guess, for that developer talent that's going on. So from that sense, I think definitely an interesting space to watch within EMEA.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for the questions for today. And just to wrap up, David, put back to the slides in.
There's one more question actually, Liam.
Oh, yeah, sorry, just seen that come through. Do you feel an older age should be considered more in a profile and not a liability? I guess obviously there's the legal issues there on tracking of age in certain countries, UK included, but David or Sven?
As a political question,
almost
It's a political question, I guess.
Question.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
yeah.
first because you're older.
I don't think age.
Ask...
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of the vendors look, and corporates actually look at diversity across the last few years, and a lot of them are attempting to be less conscious to those kind of biases. It means something different in every kind of region. Age is gender, for example, is quite a difficult topic to discuss, obviously in certain, like in Germany, for example. In the UK, it's also around social kind of elements, and it's a little bit different within each country in Europe, what they understand by diversity. So I would think of it as experience and skills rather than age. And definitely it is something where I guess from a corporate perspective, they are interested because they have to in every talent that is out there, no matter the color of the skin or the age or the shoe size or those kind of things, I guess. So definitely a more openness probably is.
I think a couple of points on that is, to some degree, the tighter the labor market, the more you kind of also need to explore whatever options are there, right? Depending on what you're doing. I think the other interesting thing that we've seen is historically, you know, the talent acquisition space has been a little bit over siloed. I think within a lot of organizations, it's sort of its own fiefdom, running its own way with its own things. And its measure of success is the ability to fill a role, right? So time to hire and those kind of metrics, cost to hire, are the things that mattered. Not what was the performance, what was the contribution of the individual that was made, that we hired, right? Did they even turn up? Did they even stay? Sometimes is an issue, let alone, are they a high performer when they, you know, how do they perform when they get there? And as I said, there is a shift, I think, generally to look at both, you know, of high talent roles, but also to look at the frontline worker roles. And I think if you put all of that jigsaw together, I think ultimately the real question is who are the best people for us to hire to achieve what we're trying to do? And I think from that point of view, especially as, you know, from a D&I point of view, we're starting to try and anonymize a lot of those processes. I'm not sure that necessarily the age discrimination is the biggest factor driving many of those yet, but ultimately the fuller conclusion is that potentially should be the case. And ultimately it comes down to, you know, if some of the better hires you have are older people or more experienced, then ultimately that will be the big thing that probably drives the biggest shift, etc. as well. The challenge to that, though, is everybody's also trying to deal with the problem of having a more agile business and a fast to learn and inherently digital business as well, right? So that in some ways pushes you towards maybe younger resources at the same time. So I think it's an interesting challenge.
In one more question before we wrap up, and I think also on that last point as well, David, it's around age. We're seeing AI create bias actually by skimming the CVs and actually getting past that as well. It's an interesting point around the whole AI discussion. Okay, the last question for today: do you see the demand interest in workforce analytics working its way to Europe in the near future?
Yes.
Sure.
We're really interested. Yeah, we're actually really interested. So the whole thing around, I guess, workforce intelligence, and then the analytics around it, and then what we do with it. There's also a shift within all of this to basically skills as a basic language of describing things rather than job role, experience, etc., things like this. But definitely, I think within that there is an increase in focus on the ability to analyze it and to determine what makes up your best kind of the best strategy for your company going forward. And that's also being reflected, like on the HR side, we're really interested around almost the renaissance in strategic workforce planning and some of those things, partly as a consequence to the pandemic making big shifts on business. So yes, absolutely. And at a European level, not just in the US.
Perfect. Thanks very much, David. Do you want to just move to the last few slides here? Thank you. Okay, before we wrap up for the day, I just want to highlight a couple of key things. And this is what we find, and this is from our research, that less than 50% of corporate buyers are happy with their buying decisions around HR and learning technologies. So a key part of what we do is actually that deep analysis around that, and you can come to us and we can give you that input. The 9 grid that we've kind of gone through today is the tip of the iceberg in the data that we hold. We can only surface so much, and I'll address on how you can dig deeper into our analysis. And typically by engaging with us, you can actually reduce your procurement cycle by up to about 70% in reducing the costs and increasing that project success. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the 9 grid that we're showing today is actually, I refer to it as being the tip of the iceberg. We have a vast amount of data and research is kind of the bedrock of what Fosway does. So we have corporate memberships available to corporates. We work with over 3,000 corporates around the world. But our corporate membership is really an invitation network for learning and HR leaders to dig much deeper into the data behind our research on our realities research, our 9 grids, and also the specialism papers that we do. It gives exclusive market and vendor insights and benchmarking tools. And apart from these RCN sessions that you're joining today, we also run roundtables exclusively for our corporate members. And you can become a corporate member by going to our website, and it's free of charge if you partake in our research, which I'll touch on in a moment. And a big part of today has, actually a lot of questions today have been around AI. So we actually have 2 roundtables on AI coming up. We have one on the 6th of July, that's around AI and its impact on learning teams. And shortly after that, we have another event on the 19th of July, exploring the potential of generative AI in the HR technologies. So both those events, if you want to be part of those, you need to go to our website, to the corporate membership area, and just inquire there. Corporate membership is free of charge if you partake in our research, which I'll touch on next. Thank you. So as I said, research forms the foundation of what we do. And I just want to leave you with this. The talent acquisition realities research is running right now. So it's running for the rest of this month. The link is there below, but you can also get it via our website. I'd encourage everyone on this call, your peers in the industry, to partake in that. The better research that we can get, the better insight we can provide to you. And last but not least, I just want to thank everyone that's taken part today. It's both Sven and David, but probably most importantly, the audience today for those great questions and actually helping us out on this. So I encourage you to partake in that research, and the recording of this webinar and the presentation will be available on our website about a week from now. So thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.